What if I told you that the greatest monument of Rome, the Colosseum, was less about glory and more about cruelty? We think of it as a marvel of architecture, a wonder of the ancient world. But behind those arches, Rome turned suffering into spectacle and death into entertainment. And here's the paradox. The same society that gave us philosophy, law, and art also cheered as human beings were fed to lions. It's controversial, isn't it? We celebrate Rome as the cradle of civilization, yet its heartbeat was fueled by blood. That's the side of history we don't talk about enough. And the crazy part is, if you strip away the centuries, it's not so different from us. We still crave shock, drama, intrigue. We just package it differently. Rome's games were the ultimate reality show, but with higher stakes than anything on TV today. So, in this story, we're not just walking through ruins. We're stepping inside the skin of those who lived, fought, and died for the crowd's amusement. Get ready! Because the unspeakable things done in Rome's arenas weren't accidents of history. They were carefully staged performances, designed to keep an empire entertained and controlled. Not so different from how we devour crime documentaries today. Dark stories we can't look away from. The Colosseum was their Netflix binge, but with real screams instead of scripted drama. Now think about this. Why do people cheer for violence when it's packaged as spectacle? Even today, fans roar when an MMA fighter lands a brutal punch, or when a movie scene shocks us with sudden brutality. The Romans just took that instinct and amplified it to the extreme. Their arenas were built on this craving, and the crowd's energy shaped the very fate of the people inside. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until you see what happened when gladiators entered the arena. Gladiators are remembered as icons of courage, but behind the armor was usually a man who never chose that life. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or debtors, forced into the arena with no way out. Sure, a few volunteered, chasing fame and fortune, but for the majority, it was survival against impossible odds. The crowd saw heroes, but the men holding swords felt the crushing weight of chains and destiny. And yet, their stories carried an intrigue that refuses to fade even today. Picture this. Fans cheering so loudly that the sound vibrated through the bones of the fighters. Gladiators stood as both victims and celebrities, hated by some, adored by others. In a way, it mirrors modern athletes, idolized by fans, but trapped by contracts, pressure, and expectations. The difference? If a gladiator failed, he didn't just lose his career. He lost his life. That razor-thin line between glory and death kept the audience hooked. Some gladiators became so famous, their names outlived emperors themselves. They were walking contradictions, slaves who became legends, despised yet celebrated. And as the crowd raised their voices, demanding blood, every fight became more than survival. It became theater, power, and performance rolled into one. But if the gladiators were the stars of the show, the next act brought an entirely different kind of terror. Because beasts, not men, were about to take center stage. The Romans had a flair for turning the exotic into the terrifying. Lions, tigers, elephants, even crocodiles were shipped in from distant lands to become living weapons in the arena. For the crowd, it was more than just a hunt. It was proof of Rome's reach and power. Imagine the intrigue of seeing a beast you'd only heard about in stories, suddenly charging out of a cage. For the gladiator facing it, though, it wasn't wonder. It was a death sentence. Think about how we react today when we see wild animals at a zoo or on a screen. There's awe, respect, even fear, but always from safety. Now imagine being thrown into a pit with nothing but a spear. Knowing the crowd's entertainment depends on whether you live or die. That wasn't fantasy for the Romans. It was Saturday afternoon entertainment. And the crowd loved it even more when the match was unfair. Because unfairness guaranteed blood. But Rome didn't stop at simple hunts. They staged elaborate performances where animals were forced to act out scenes. Some were even starved before release, just to make their fury more spectacular. To the audience, it was mesmerizing. To the victims, it was terror in its rawest form. And as shocking as that sounds, this was only a taste of the horror to come. Because when it came to executions, Rome turned cruelty into theater. For the Romans, executions weren't hidden away in the shadows. They were staged in broad daylight as part of the show. Criminals, rebels, even ordinary people who fell out of favor were brought into the arena not just to die, but to perform. The crowd didn't want a quick end. They wanted drama. They wanted intrigue. And Rome gave it to them, turning punishment into a twisted art of cruelty. Here's the chilling part. Many executions were designed to imitate myths. A man dressed as Icarus, hurled from a high platform. Another as Orpheus, torn apart by wild beasts. To the spectators, it was like watching a live tragedy. But where the actors weren't pretending, they were actually dying. Imagine sitting in a theater today and realizing the special effects were real blood. That's the level of spectacle Rome perfected, and it echoes even now. Think of movies or TV shows that stretch out death scenes to maximize suspense. The Romans simply skipped the illusion. They gave the crowd exactly what it craved: raw suffering, dressed as performance. And if you think that's dark, wait until you hear what Rome did when the victims weren't actors in plays, but torches to light the night. Rome loved to blur the line between story and reality. And nowhere was that clearer than in their mythological executions. Instead of actors who pretended to die, the Romans used real people, real blood, and real endings. Imagine watching a performance of Hercules' labors. But the monster was a lion, tearing apart the man on stage. The crowd wasn't horrified. They were enthralled. Pulled deeper into the intrigue of myth turned flesh. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was spectacle, elevated into theater. The audience wanted to see stories they knew come alive. But with the ultimate twist: no stage tricks, no illusions, just unfiltered reality. Think of it like a modern remake, except instead of CGI effects, you had human bodies paying the price. Rome didn't just tell myths. They lived them in the cruelest way possible. And here's the part that chills the bones. The victims had no choice. They were forced to embody gods, heroes, villains, only to meet deaths that mirrored legend. It was a fusion of entertainment and execution, a macabre creativity unique to Rome. But as dark as that sounds, the cruelty was far from over. Because sometimes people weren't killed in plays at all. Sometimes they were killed just to keep the lights on. When the sun went down and the arena needed light, Rome didn't rely on oil lamps alone. Prisoners were covered in pitch, tied to stakes, and set ablaze. They became human torches, burning bodies used to light the games. It wasn't just punishment anymore. It was spectacle at any cost. And the intrigue lay in how casual the Romans were about turning life into fuel. Imagine walking into a stadium today, and instead of floodlights, you see people burning in silence. The thought alone is unbearable. Yet in Rome, it was treated as part of the entertainment package. For the spectators, it was a bonus show. For the victims, a living nightmare that ended only when the flames consumed them. That's how normalized cruelty had become. A literal light source. for Rome's obsession with display. And here's the chilling irony. The audience went home bragging about the games, but the smell of smoke lingered in the air. Horror dressed up as celebration. A fire Rome used to fuel its image of control. But Rome's creativity with cruelty didn't stop at flames. Because beneath the arena floor, engineers were building machines designed to make death even more spectacular. The Colosseum wasn't just a stage, it was a machine of death. Beneath the sand lay a labyrinth of tunnels, pulleys, and trapdoors, designed to shock both fighters and spectators. One moment the floor looked calm. The next, a bear or armed gladiator would rise from below like magic. The true masterminds weren't just emperors. They were engineers. Men who turned cruelty into spectacle, designing deaths with precision. Think of it like Hollywood special effects today. Rotating stages, sudden explosions, dazzling light shows. Except in Rome, it wasn't pyrotechnics. It was cages springing open, platforms collapsing, wild animals rushing out. The crowd gasped, not just at the fight, but at the surprise. That constant intrigue kept them hooked. Every show was different. Every execution had a twist. Engineers didn't just kill, they staged deaths with creativity. As if cruelty itself was an art form. For the audience, it proved Rome's brilliance. For the victims, it was a death sentence wrapped in theater. And if the crowd's appetite fed innovation this far, imagine the power of their voices when they demanded more. Because in Rome, the mob itself could decide who lived and who died. The roar of the crowd in a Roman arena wasn't just background noise, it was power. Tens of thousands of voices could sway the fate of a fighter. A simple chant could pressure the emperor to spare a life, or take it. Imagine standing in the sand, your life hanging on the whim of strangers who craved blood as much as bread. The intrigue of the games wasn't only in combat, it thrived in the unpredictable energy of the mob. And it's not so different today. Think of how social media can destroy reputations with a flood of angry comments, or elevate someone to instant fame with viral applause. The Romans lived that in real time. Every cheer was a vote. Every boo, a sentence. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were participating. Injustice, entertainment, and cruelty all at once. But there's danger in giving that much power to a mob. It feeds on escalation. Once they tasted one spectacle, they demanded the next be bloodier. And emperors knew this. They used it, feeding the appetite of the people to secure their own popularity. And when the emperor himself was present, the games became more than blood sport. They became a political performance. When the emperor entered the arena, every eye shifted to him. His presence alone carried more weight than any gladiator's sword. The games were never just entertainment. They were propaganda, a living reminder of who held the power of life and death. By funding massive spectacles, emperors proved their wealth, their generosity, and their control. Picture a modern leader hosting the biggest Super Bowl halftime show, but with real lives at stake. That's how emperors built loyalty. Through cruelty disguised as generosity, and it worked. The people left entertained, grateful, even indebted to the ruler who gave them blood to feast on. But here's the subtle trick. The emperor didn't always need to act. Sometimes just his gaze was enough. A nod, a glance, and the crowd would fall silent. Hesitate, or change their vote on mercy. His power wasn't only in the games themselves, but in the way he manipulated perception. And yet, even the might of the emperor couldn't outlast time. What remains of those spectacles today isn't their glory. It's the shadows of horror they left behind. Centuries later, the Colosseum still stands. A skeleton of its past, whispering the stories of blood spilled on its floor. Tourists wander through the ruins, snapping photos, but few stop to imagine the cries that once echoed there. The legacy isn't stone arches or broken seats. It's the memory of how far humans will go when cruelty is dressed as entertainment. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring intrigue of all, because echoes of those spectacles still creep into our culture today. We cheer for brutal knockouts in combat sports. We binge-watch violent dramas. We scroll endlessly through videos of chaos online. The context is different, yes, but the hunger for shock, drama, and intensity remains the same. Rome perfected the theater of cruelty, and the audience it created, it never really disappeared. It just changed seats. And here's the haunting question. If you or I lived back then, would we turn away in disgust? Or would we lean forward with the crowd, cheering for more? History doesn't just tell us what happened. It forces us to look inward. The Colosseum may be silent now, but its lessons are still alive, challenging us to ask what we find entertaining and why. So here's the challenge the Colosseum leaves us with. What does our appetite for entertainment say about us? The Romans dressed cruelty in grandeur, and people cheered without hesitation. Today, the packaging looks different, but the craving for spectacle, for shock, for intrigue still lingers. Ask yourself this. If you had lived in Rome, would you have stood with the crowd, roaring for blood? Or would you have turned away in silence, unable to stomach the cruelty? History forces us to confront not just what they did, but what we might do if placed in the same arena. So what do you think? Would you survive as a gladiator? Would you have the courage to resist the crowd? Or would you become part of the roar? Share your thoughts below, because your answer says more about the present than it does about the past. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden darker corners of history, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me for the next story. Because history is never as distant as it seems, and the next tale may hit closer to home than you think.
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.